All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about how environment artists think about their scenes, let's talk a little bit about planning them. Now, there are several things to consider when initially planning your scene. And we touched on a few of these in the last video, but let's dive a little bit deeper here. We talked about scope a bit in the previous video when we discussed interior versus exterior scenes. However, even though we have already settled on an exterior scene, we still need to think about scope here. Now, I'm going to use some more generic examples in this video rather than talking about our specific scene because I want to really illustrate that these are design principles that apply to any type of environment. So remember that we want to keep our kit to no more than 50 unique pieces. So we need to think about what type of space is going to allow us to do that. Say you wanted to create a supermarket. Now, while this does have a lot of repeating elements, you would need to create hundreds of unique assets to fill the entirety of this store. So there are a few ways to scale this idea down somewhat. One very popular method is to create an abandoned supermarket, like something you might see in a Fallout game, such as the example pictured here. Most of the shelves here are empty from looting and the store is in disarray. Not only does this reduce the need for hundreds of unique products to fill out the shelves, but it also adds an element of storytelling that a functioning supermarket might not have. If your project allows for it, another method for reducing scope is to focus on one segment of a greater area and only create and render that one section, say a single narrow aisle of the store or a single display case. However, you may need to do some additional work in world building to create storytelling elements in a more generic space such as this one. So what makes a good candidate for a modular scene? First, it needs to have repeating elements. Now, we did touch on this a bit already. We want our scene to feel larger than it really is by using duplicate objects from a relatively small kit to fill out a larger space. It needs to be contained, meaning you don't have long sight lines that you have to fill out with an infinite number of objects. You should have a clear idea of where your scene stops. And lastly, opportunity for storytelling. Keep in mind that environments, whether or not you plan incorporating them into a larger project, should tell a story. You could have the most beautifully rendered and technically clean scene that is possible, but if there are no storytelling elements, the likelihood that this scene is going to catch someone's eye is very low. Basically, don't make a boring scene. Now, we can brainstorm our storytelling elements by asking ourselves the W questions. First up is who? Who uses this space? Is it public or private? Is it the small private study of a reclusive wizard, or is it a football stadium filled with thousands of fans? Thinking about the characters that might inhabit your spaces can start to make the environments come to life. Next is what? What is the purpose or function of this space? What do the users do in it? Do they run through a challenging obstacle course in this space or sit in quiet contemplation by the window? How does this function affect the form of the room? What types of spaces and objects are needed for this environment to function as intended? Where? Where is this environment in relation to the world around it? Is it in the middle of an Arizona desert? Is it in the frozen Antarctic? How does this change the lighting and the types of objects that you might find in the room? When? What period of time does this space exist in? If it's an Old West saloon, how will that differ from a modern dive bar? Why? Why do the inhabitants of this space need to use it? If it's the wizard's study, why is he using it? What is he working on? How can we communicate that to the viewer in a scene absent of actual characters? And lastly, how? Now, this is something you should ask yourself after each of the previous questions, as I did for those examples. How does the form of the space inform the answers to who is using it for what purpose, where, when, and why? Now, if you can answer all of these questions about your space, you likely have a good candidate for a 3D scene, at least from the storytelling aspect of it. So you've got an idea for an environment. What now? Well, before we begin building anything, we need to do even more planning. Now, the best way to build a compelling scene in 3D is to start with a compelling concept. Now, we have sort of a concept in that we have a rough idea of what our scene is going to be, but we need visual concepts in order to make it look convincing. Now, if you are new to environment art or you feel that your 2D painting skills are not especially strong, I do recommend you use work from professional concept artists to inform your scenes. Not only will you have a stronger finished piece, but you will also learn a lot about what makes for good environment design by studying the work of professionals. Now, there are several places that you can source concept art for your personal pieces. I recommend ArtStation, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is an online platform for artists to host their portfolios. Another great source of concepts is Pinterest. I personally use this more for finding photographs, as the quality of the images does tend to be better than a standard Google image search, although that, of course, is always an option for you as well. Now, if you feel you are more advanced in design or you come from a 2D art background, you may consider creating an original design for your concept. Basically, all this is creating your own drawings or paintings of your scenes, which will give you more concrete ideas on composition, framing, lighting, and mood for your scene. One popular method for concept artists to speed up their workflow is to use 3D paintovers. A 3D paintover is essentially a method for creating 2D environment concepts. It begins with an artist forming a rough block out of the scene in a 3D program, such as Blender, then taking a still image of that scene, bringing it into a 2D image editing software, such as Photoshop, and literally painting the details over it to form the finished concept. This saves the concept artist a lot of time trying to get the perspective right, as the 3D rendering program will automatically put everything into proper perspective based on the camera angle. This allows the artist to focus their energy on really nailing the details, the colors, and the mood of the scene without having to worry about the technical aspects of drawing in perspective. Okay, so once we have our overall concept, we can begin breaking it down into its modular elements. I recommend starting with a color-coded draw over, such as the one I have here. From there, you can start to compile a list of all the pieces that you're going to need to make. So in this example here, I would write a list of every piece I have highlighted here. Now, for the sake of clarity, I did not highlight things like the actual wall and floor pieces, but these should be included in your list. Once you have an idea of what assets you will need to make for your scene, it is time to start gathering additional references. Now, regardless of where you source your concepts, you are going to need to gather additional resources and references of specific objects that you plan to build for your scene. While concept art is great for giving the general idea of the environment, it is somewhat limited in that we can only view the concept art from one angle. Whereas when building a 3D asset for your scene, we need to build all sides of it. So gather as much reference as you can, both of entire scenes that are similar to the one you are creating and of individual objects within your scene. The more reference you have, the better you can make decisions about your objects and their placement in your environment. Once you have started to gather reference images, you are going to want a way to organize them so you can quickly reference the images you need while working in Blender. Personally, I prefer to use a program called PureRef. This is a free software that you can download from the PureRef website. And basically what it does is gives you a blank canvas onto which you can drag and drop your images and organize them in a free-form way. I'm going to demonstrate how this works in a future video. Another solid option here is to use Pinterest. I mentioned Pinterest is a good place to source concepts and references, but if you make a free account, you can also save any images on the site to boards, which you can organize in any way you please. The result is a board somewhat like those made through PureRef, but Pinterest has the advantage of being online and browser-based, so you can access them from any device, whereas PureRef boards will be saved locally to whatever machine you are using. Now, if you are averse to either of these methods, you can always just save images to a folder on your hard drive. However, it may make organization a little bit more difficult. You cannot view your images side by side in a sort of mood board format, the way that the other two options allow you to do. No matter how you choose to source and organize your references, the key takeaway here is that reference gathering is not optional. If you don't believe me, go try to draw a leaf right now, as realistically as you possibly can without looking at a reference. And you'll quickly realize that you've never really looked at a leaf before. So reference gathering is an absolute must, and believe me when I say that no professional artist works without reference. All right, the last subject I want to touch on in this video is about staying organized. Now, staying organized in a project of this scale can be a task in and of itself. I do recommend you sort out how you want to keep track of your progress, though, because it will make it really clear what steps you need to take next at any given point in your project. It's very easy to sort of lose track of what you were doing midway through a large project, but keeping written notes about your plan will help you stay on track and stay motivated. Additionally, if your goal is to become a professional environment artist, staying organized is really important for keeping track of your deliverables and gives you a better indication of how long certain aspects of the project will take for you to communicate to your clients. Now, there are many ways to go about keeping track of your progress. Personally, I like to use Trello. It is a free web-based service for managing projects of any type. You will need to make an account, but as I said, the basic features of it are free to use. It's also particularly good for team projects as it is online, and anyone that is part of the project can see and track the progress of other members of the team. That being said, I imagine most of you taking this course are working independently, so use whatever organizational method works best for you. Just try to be consistent within the project and make sure you are actually record your updates to it. Otherwise, it becomes quickly meaningless. So that is all I really wanted to cover in this video about planning and staying organized. In the next video, we are going to come back and actually do sort of a live demo on planning and reference gathering.